Now, following last week's interview on the reuse of graves, the South African Cemeteries Association has come forward to dispute some of the statements made by the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights of Communities. Now, they say the issue was politicized and that municipalities are faced with a big task of adhering to national policies. So we are joined from our studios in Durban by Peppy Das. He's the chairman of the South African Cemeteries Association. Peppy, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Just very quickly, before we get into the conversation, what is it that your association does? What is your mandate?
All right. What has happened was, over the years, cemetery service providers, and I'm referring to officials largely at local government level, that are challenged to actually provide a decent service to the public, realized that we were finding our jobs very difficult. One of the contributing factors was that we were running out of land, and we needed to find ways to basically capacitate ourselves in order to deal with these challenges. The other, of course, was to professionalize our services, because you don't have a university that teaches you how to provide a cemetery service. There is training provided largely for the funeral undertakers industry, but nothing really provided or designed for actual cemetery services. You know, the actual provision of infrastructure and the maintenance of infrastructure.
Okay.
So we saw the need for us to basically come together and set up an organization that would professionalize our services. That's one, and to also capacitate the actual service provider. I'm talking about people like supervisors, managers of cemeteries, and maybe some of the senior managers within the organizations, to understand, you know, what our challenges are about and how best we can train ourselves to serve those challenges.
Okay. Hence,
we set ourselves as a non-profit organization, which is registered with the Department of Social Development, with the aim of being the leading facilitator for this kind of service.
Yeah. All right, let's now get into the crux of the matter. Last week we did an interview with the South African Cemeteries Association, I beg your pardon, with the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights of Communities. They were saying that we at a situation where grave sites are being reused, and we're finding that families are being very, very disappointed to visit the grave sites of their loved ones and actually find that somebody else is buried there. You disagreed with a lot of the statements made by the CEO, Tokom Kwenazi Kaluva. What are you disputing?
All right. Look, the issue of reuse of graves is not an illegal act. That we need to understand that. And it's been a practice with many communities in this country over the years. In some communities more than others. It's not uncommon to have, for example, families reusing graves in which previous family members were interred in.
Yeah. So let's just, before we
yes.
move on, let me clarify that when you say the reuse of graves is not illegal, in terms of the family, not strangers.
Well, within KwaZulu-Natal, we have the KwaZulu-Natal Cemeteries and Crematoria Act, which also allows for the reuse of graves. And I would assume that these pieces of legislation are in place in order to promote sustainable practices, and it's quite a critical issue when it comes to the use of natural resources.
Yeah.
And that's where the actual challenge is. The challenge is identifying land which is suitable for burials, because you may have the claim that where there are large stretches of land, you know, why can't we just utilize this? Especially as people drive to the countryside, they figure that land is all available for burial. But that's not necessarily so. The window of opportunity to actually develop those pieces of land gets reduced when one considers a number of factors. And these factors could be, for example, the suitability in terms of the geotechnical suitability. Is the soil good enough? Is there rock in the ground? is there an underwater ground source, which is also starting to prove to be a challenge in this country when we look at our water resources.
Yeah.
So all of these factors play a role in terms of how far cemeteries may be developed from these water sites, and of course whether we are able to actually dig up the soil and bury a body. One must understand that if you have unsuitable soil, then it leads to problems. Because one of the reasons that bodies are buried was not necessarily it was tradition. It might have evolved over a process of thousands of years to actually respect the remains and to keep the remains away from attack from wild animals, for that matter. So sticking a body 6 feet in the ground is actually an unnatural act. But over the millennia, it's become a sort of a traditional practice, or a cultural. It's been incorporated as a cultural practice. It's a healthy way. It's a healthy way to a certain extent to deal with these remains as the way we would deal with other remains and other matter. But the very practice of putting bodies into the ground poses a problem.
Yeah.
So whilst we want to respect the cultural rights of people, we have to also understand that we have a serious obligation with regards to how one preserves the land.
Yeah.
And the resources, so that we may sustain our survival.
Yeah, but let's get back down to basics, because we're going into the history of burials now. But as it stands right now, burials it's a massive tradition. It's a cultural tradition, religious traditions, and we have to respect people's rights, and this is what they would like. But I want to get back to the actual issue at hand. The families going and visiting grave sites, finding other bodies buried on top of their loved ones. This is not with a family consent. Surely that is illegal. This must be an illegal practice.
Okay, yes, if one had to do that without following certain reasonable processes, then of course that would be illegal.
Now that's what
we are guided.
Yeah. That was what
But we are guided by legislation.
Indeed, but that was what the Commission, those are the statements that the Commission were making, is that these acts happen, particularly here in the urban areas, because of the lack of space, that you'll find that the graves are being reused. So from your point of view, what are you disputing? What is it that you're saying was not correct in what they had to say?
All right, there were a few issues that were raised in the report, but to focus around the issue of actual incorrect, or you want to say, if you want to call it that, the use of graves by other families, which was possibly facilitated by the local authority. Look, there are ways in which to deal with this, because the actual facts in terms of these disputes were not presented, I think. I've been with the eThekwini municipality and involved with cemeteries now for about 15 years.
Yeah.
And you know, if there's an issue like this that's raised, then I think there's a responsibility, and in all fairness, to actually bring the officials of the municipality, you know, to answer to these actual challenges. And I'm not really aware of some of them. So these may have been, they could have been an administrative error if these were real, but we didn't even have an opportunity to look at that. You know, did this actually happen? And then let's look at the concept of how we reuse graves. The first thing we would do before we reuse a grave is to actually make contact with the family. Of course, you must understand the practice of burials expands years. So somebody may be buried for about 20 years, and people have moved on. And there may be no visitors to a grave over that period of time. And what happens then is we make an attempt to actually contact family. And if we fail, then by regulation, which is legislated, we advertise our intentions over a period of time that we will reuse the grave. And if there are any objections, then those family members must step forward. So we do that through the media. It's regulated, the time frames. And we are very quick to protect any grave that an objection is raised. What we expect families to do is that if they want to reuse graves, is then let's lease that piece of land to protect your right to reuse it. And in terms of the municipal bylaws, if you don't lease that piece of land, then the authority to use that land reverts back to the municipality. But of course, we exercise due diligence in terms of how we go and how we practice the reuse of those graves. So it did not make sense for somebody to say that families were not aware that we were reusing graves. Because these intentions are what do you call it, publicized. And of course, this is a practice that has been in existence within the municipality for more than 50 years. In some of our communities, for example, in Chesterville, the reuse of graves has been going on for over 30 years, 40 years. And those communities who are traditionally practicing burials are also aware of the practice because they're actually involved in it. They've accepted those practices. So it seems very unusual, to make these claims that we are being very irresponsible. And I don't just speak on what may have happened and how the report had directed its attention to one particular municipality, but this is the kind of practice that happens all over the country. Municipal officials do exercise due diligence, and we felt that this was not being portrayed in this way. All
right, okay. Well, thank you for coming on. Thank you very much for talking to us and giving your side of the story and clarifying a few issues for us. However, I think still an issue that needs to be taken further, and a big issue here in South Africa. Space is particularly, I think, at the root of all of that. Pepe Das, chairman of the South African Cemeteries Association, thanks for joining us from our Durban studios this morning.
Thank you, Leanne.
All right, absolute pleasure. Let's take a